racism in schools is on the cards. For more, we're joined in the studio by the Commission CEO, Qayyum Ahmed. Ms. Ahmed, thank you very much for coming in this morning. Have you started an investigation into racism in schools? I mean, we've seen lots of cases, including the one we've just been reporting on this morning from eMalahleni in Mpumalanga.
Absolutely. Out of the nearly 10,000 complaints that the South African Human Rights Commission deals with on an annual basis, racism remains the #1 complaint that we continue to look at 21 years into our democracy. And it's deeply concerning and troubling for us as a young democracy that we continue to deal with this issue, particularly a growing number of cases in schools and primary schools. And this is particularly concerning for us given that we expect young people to be able to grow up in a democracy where they are not exposed to the apartheid legacy. And yet this is something that we continue to see.
And we see in that report from eMalahleni in that school, you have a principal who's been now suspended by the education officials, and you have a parent who's phoning one of the teachers or one of the senior members of that school, and they're swearing at her, calling her a baboon and calling her stupid. It's unbelievable stuff.
No, it is. It's absolutely unbelievable. And this happens both in the private schools as well as public schools. Not too long ago, we saw the case of the Kuro schools where kids were being separated on the basis of their race. And of course, sometimes culture and language is often used as substitutes.
Which is exactly what apartheid used. Precisely. Let's not forget that apartheid used to divide us and balkanize us according to culture and different languages.
Absolutely. And so we're seeing a continuation of this. And the perpetrators are usually teachers in these instances as opposed to students against students.
You say that you're getting about 10,000 complaints, and the bulk of them about racism. Just to get an understanding, before I just ask you what you're going to be doing in the investigation on schools racism in particular, who is filing these complaints? Where is the source of the complaints from? Is it mainly from black South Africans or from white South Africans, or is it a combination of both?
There is a combination and complaints from both divides, part of the country, but the overwhelming majority of complaints are lodged by black South Africans against white South Africans. We continue to find that white South Africans are, generally speaking, the greater perpetrators of cases of racism, but there have, of course, been cases of black South Africans who've said things about white South Africans that we've also investigated.
Okay, now, how do you do an investigation into the schools' racism? Are you getting the parents involved, the children involved, the authorities from those schools involved?
In a situation like this, I think it's imperative we get all of the stakeholders involved. Often what we find is sitting around the table, engaging and discussing in dialogue around these issues is probably one of the best routes to take. But if this fails, we are obliged to then go to court to try and resolve the matter. That is a last resort. We do hope that we can resolve this by looking into racism in schools in a more systemic way, not simply focusing on isolated cases, but looking at the situation across the country.
So it's going to be a broader investigation. Now, what action can you take against somebody who is found guilty of racism or accused of racism as a commission?
The Human Rights Commission, of course, has limitations in terms of its mandate and powers, but what we are able to do is to ensure that there's some sort of reconciliation, whether it's in the form of an apology, or sometimes we would go to the Equality Court where financial compensation is actually paid. So it really depends on the gravity of the situation.
Now, things are serious. 10,000 cases and the bulk of racism complaints you are getting. Maybe there are more complaints that are not reaching you. Do you think South Africa as a whole needs now to have an urgent dialogue, 21 years almost into our democracy, around where are we at as a nation regarding how we see one another, how we treat one another as human beings?
Absolutely. You know, in 1994, all of the racists disappeared suddenly when we moved into democracy. Today, 21 years later, we're beginning to see a lot more of the racist attitudes emanating. I think people have forgotten about where we've come from, and the need for a dialogue is absolutely critical. We've already engaged with the Nelson Mandela Foundation and institutions such as the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation around questions of race and racism, and we hope to roll out a series of dialogues which will ultimately engage with communities on the question of race and racism.
Should racism be criminalized?
We've adopted an approach where racism is certainly, the acts of racism have been criminalized in the sense that action can be taken against you for saying certain words, but we've not gone the route, say, of Germany, where Nazism has been completely banned. So we've taken a middle-of-the-road approach. The Constitution is a lot more open and progressive in that regard, but there are certainly clear limitations to the right to freedom of expression, for instance, as indicated in the
critics would
Constitution.
argue that the Constitution is not helping. 21 years into this open society of ours, people are still racist.
I don't think that it's the Constitution that's the problem. It's the application of the constitutional principles that are not being implemented, and I think that's where the problem lies. Huge values gap between our personal values as South Africans and the constitutional values, and I think this is the gap that needs to be filled.
Mr. Ahmed, while I have you here, just to ask another question. Access to water is a basic right in our Constitution. We are reporting on a story this morning about people in Klipgat in the Northwest stealing water or having, from Tshwane, and they're saying their own municipality is not providing water. We had these water problems Mujakaneng recently in Northwest as well. It went on a protest because of water. Mututlung in near Brits last year. What's the view of the Commission when it comes to those kind of basic rights, in this case, water?
Access to water is an absolutely fundamental socioeconomic right that's contained in our Constitution. We recently also ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And so there's also an international obligation on our government, on the state, to ensure that people are provided with water. It's an absolutely fundamental basic right. We've done significant investigations and research into this matter and have already presented a report to Parliament on this issue where various recommendations were made. I think all we can do now is to call upon our government and Parliament to ensure that those recommendations are implemented, because without water there really cannot be life, and consequently rights will inevitably be violated as a result of that.
Thank you very much. That's SA Human Rights Commission CEO Kayum Ahmed.